The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a review of a discussion between Matt Dillahunty and Dinesh D'Souza. So this one's a bit unusual because this was and was not a debate. There were a number of questions that people have asked me, which I'm going to try to address. The entire debate or discussion is already out there. I've already added it to Patreon, and people can actually view the full discussion. And generally speaking, I'm fairly happy with how it went. And I'm fairly happy with my responses and even some things that some people objected to, but I wanted to go through it. Before this discussion happened, I did kind of a preparatory video last month where I had a hangout with people to talk about what questions they wanted asked. As you can see from the discussion, it was supposed to be about God, Trump, and the future of America, but we didn't really touch on those topics all that much. It was rather meandering and difficult to stay focused. But there were a handful of subjects discussed, and I want to kind of go through them in short order here, especially for the people who don't have the interest in going and actually watching the full discussion. And for those of you who do, then you can verify that my brain is working correctly and I'm accurately representing what went down. So let's talk about that evening. So first of all, as I pointed out, this wasn't a debate. And then by that, I mean there were just the two of us on stage. There was no set format. There were no time guidance. There was, I was acting as the interlocutor for him, as well as kind of the moderator and the person steering it. And I wanted to make sure of a few things. One, that he was able to speak. And so there were people who were like, why didn't you interrupt him more? You let him talk like 4 times as much as you talked. I don't think that's accurate. I'm not even sure that he spent twice as much time talking as I spoke. But I wanted to make sure that when he said something, I was giving him the opportunity to present his case as best he could. And that way, when it came time for me to offer a rebuttal, I could, and I did during the debate, point out, hang on, I let you finish that point, let me respond. And I'm fine with the back and forth, and we even spoke about it ahead of time, saying, hey, it's okay if we interrupt each other. We both agree that we trust the audience in general to not immediately assume that somebody's interrupting to hide something or to deflect something, and that if that is in fact what they are doing, that the audience is smart enough to figure this out. We essentially were both optimistic about being treated fairly, and I don't think that either of us would have any grounds to say, oh, that discussion was completely unfair. I didn't get to speak my mind. I didn't get to make my case, and I was completely misrepresented. On the other hand, what I can say is what I said during the debate, which is that I don't know that I've ever been strawmanned so much in a debate. And somebody just went, you just said you couldn't complain about it, now you're complaining. No. I was able to point that out. As a matter of fact, there's a moment in the debate where I suggested that at some point somebody should go through and find out how many times he tried to present both his position and my position and managed to get my position wrong, because this happened over and over again. While the discussion was supposed to be about God, Trump, and the future of America, I thought we would start with God and what his reasons were for believing in a God. This derailed fairly quickly into a discussion about epistemology, essentially what makes for good evidence. What sort of things would we expect or need in order to have a reasonable belief that a God exists? That's fine. It's a good discussion to have. And fortunately, that discussion very quickly got to a point where I think we identified the fundamental flaw in how he views epistemology, and I was able to point this out. I won't rehash all of it, but suffice it to say that the words that came out of his mouth were essentially, let's assume that neither of us have any evidence for a life after death. His claim is that he is not on weaker epistemological footing if he chooses to believe, or if he in fact believes that there is life after death. He's not on weaker footing than I am if I don't believe there's life after death. That is just by definition and by acknowledgement and even by his own words in other areas, clearly false. If you and I agree that we have no evidence for an afterlife, and we both sit here and say, I don't know what happens after we die, and then you say that you believe there is a life after death, and you're not going to, we've already agreed we don't have evidence to point to reach that conclusion, and I say I don't believe that, you don't get to pretend that we're on equal footing with regard to soundness, with regard to whether or not we are being rational. Even if you had some private personal experience, that would count as some type of evidence toward your claim, but it would only be evidence that would be good for you. But he's not even citing that. He's just flat out acknowledging, yep, we're both here. Neither one of us know what happens after we're dead. Although, as I pointed out in an email discussion after this, I do have a positive belief that nothing about me does persist after death. I'm not going to claim to know it. I don't think it rises quite to the level of knowledge, but I've pointed out before that the soul is the most obviously dead concept in all of theology, and the notion of a life after death is the one that we can probably come closest to debunking, essentially, because everything that we know about what makes us us is part of the brain and would seem to cease functioning when the brain ceases functioning. But the key thing there is you have two people who are looking at something. Both of them are acknowledging we don't have evidence for this proposition. And one of them saying, I believe it, and don't you dare accuse me of being on weaker footing than you when you don't believe it. It would have been better if he would have said that he believed there's an afterlife and that he was convinced that I actively believed there was not an afterlife. And then we could have had a discussion about what the epistemological footing is for that, because while I don't know, and I'm certainly not certain, I love that phrase, certainly not certain, about what happens to us after we die, if anything, I do have beliefs in that area, but we didn't even get to discuss it. He just made the mistake right there of saying two people have no evidence. One of them believes that A is the case, the other one is not convinced that A is the case, and they're somehow on similar footing. That was a problem. There was a number of times during this discussion, and I managed to point this out as well, where many times we would discuss an issue, and I, as a secular humanist, would come at it from the standpoint of human beings and how human beings were affected and what could improve or damage human beings' lives. On a number of occasions, he just went to money. It was, why do I have to pay? When we talked about climate change briefly, which wasn't even something I was planning to discuss, and I'm not sure how much we disagree on the facts of the matter, his concern is that the Obamas just bought a big property on the coast, and if they really believed that climate change was real, there's no way they'd do that, because that money's going right down the tubes as soon as that coastline, is taken over. And I tried to point out that, first of all, what the Obamas do or don't believe about climate change is irrelevant to what's actually going on with climate change and what percentage of actual science experts hold a particular view. I'm looking at the actual data, the scientific consensus, and I'm reaching tentative conclusions that are consistent with the evidence. And he's going by whether or not the elitists who evidently want him to change things about his life, if they're hypocritical or not, which is certainly evidence as to what they may think. But as I pointed out, there could be many reasons why somebody would still buy property there, because even with climate change putting the price of the property at risk, Maybe they have information or knowledge or awareness that it's likely to go up temporarily at some point. Maybe they just have that extra money laying around and they decide before the coasts are gone, I'm going to have some coastal property and enjoy that. Who knows? Maybe they're climate change deniers. But you don't get to cite how the Obamas spend their money as if it somehow debunks claims about science, about climate change. This was a common theme when we talked about healthcare and how I viewed it as a right and how it was smart for us to have better health care and how ensuring that other people are vaccinated encourages herd immunity, how the lives of the people around you, if you've got a teller at a grocery store making $10, $12 an hour and you don't want to pay them more, now they're going to have to work when they're sick, which increases the likelihood that somebody else gets sick. We're dealing with stuff like that now with the COVID pandemic and the fact that I'm here in Austin, Texas, where the mayor has got a stay-at-home order, and there are more and more cities and counties and states that are putting everybody on lockdown. And how long is it going to last? We don't know. It's fortunate, I think, that we managed to deal with this topic a little bit before the pandemic started, but it was right at the beginnings of it. And he made predictions about Trump getting reelected, and I pointed out that I think that's a likelihood, and that if Trump gets elected, the markets will soar. Clearly, that's not going to necessarily be the case. They may recover after the coronavirus stuff, but that if Bernie got elected, the markets would tank. Now, at some point, we'll be able to perhaps hold his feet to the fire for what his predictions were. But that was really the only discussion about Trump that took place. And when we had a conversation about healthcare and it potentially being a right and how we should care about other people because their lives affect us, I was approaching it from a humanist standpoint, and he once again approached it from a financial standpoint. And he argued essentially two different things all related to this money stuff. One is that you could claim that groceries were right, and then somebody would go into a grocery store who only needed 1 gallon of milk, and they would get 10 gallons of milk. And I pointed out during the debate the flaw in this analogy, which is I'm not going to go in and have 10 gallbladder surgeries just for kicks. The thing that I didn't say, which I probably should have said, but I thought it'd be clear, is that his analogy is already absurd at its face. When it comes to medical issues, we have regulations, we have the Hippocratic Oath. You can't just go in to your doctor and say, I'd like 2 of those pills and 1 of those pills and that, and I'd like this surgery and this surgery. That's not the way medicine works, because we recognize that there are some individuals who would abuse the system. There are some individuals who are already abusing the system, but we have this issue of do no harm. You could make groceries, food, a right and have it be state supported. And you could find a way to regulate that so that nobody gets to walk in needing 1 gallon of milk and walking out with 10. It's just asinine to think that, to portray this as if, oh, it's free food, take whatever you want. That's not the way healthcare is at all. It's not, hey, here's free healthcare, do as many surgeries as you want. His analogy was horribly flawed, and it was all concerns about money. The same thing was true when we talked about income disparity. He basically said, well, in the 70s, CEOs were just inflated managers or something, but now CEOs create things like the iPhone and Facebook, and so they deserve this massive wealth disparity. Now, as I pointed out in the debate, I'm happy for people who create stuff to be compensated fairly, even extraordinarily, for their accomplishments. But the question that I asked him was, how many iPhones did Steve Jobs produce? Oh, millions. No, none. They were built and produced by other people. They were designed, built, produced, shipped, sold, and attended to by other people. The bulk of the actual work isn't just I had an idea, now I get to be a billionaire, while people putting my idea into practice that are earning me this $1 billion don't have health care, working paycheck to paycheck, aren't compensated fairly, etc. I'm not for some flat level, everybody, I mean, it's not communism we're advocating for, where you don't have any property and everything belongs to the government. That's not what I'm saying at all. But to argue that, oh, well, the wealth gap isn't a problem because what's happening now is CEOs are creating something that makes them deserving of having ridiculous amounts of wealth. That's where it kept going throughout the discussion. There were a couple other things that were talked about during this event. One of them I'm not going to address here, and that was his absolutely god-awful shit show of an analogy about trans people. And he did this by suggesting that he could claim he was a toad and hop around on the stage. I'm relatively happy with the response that I gave, which was full-throated support for transitioning, and even pointing out that even if what he had held to be the case with regard to mental illness or whatever else was correct, that the experts are still in a position where the best thing that we can do is be supportive of transitioning. And, he made weird comments. We talked about going into bathrooms, and I'm like, is there anything that's stopping me from walking into a women's bathroom right now? Well, no. Okay. Is there any evidence that having trans women or trans men use the bathroom that is associated with their gender has caused a problem for anybody else, that somebody else is in danger? I tell you, the evidence is that the trans individuals are the ones that are in danger, depending on which busybody decides to say, oh, no, you're not using the bathroom that I personally think you should use. And Dinesh talked about if I went into the women's restroom and his wife was in there, she'd get upset if I popped my testicles out. And I pointed out, he's assuming that I have testicles. But the other thing is, I do have testicles and a penis, and I've gone into public bathrooms for ages, and I don't know what his obsession was with me popping my testicles out, because I've stood in a line of urinals with a bunch of other people who have penises and testicles for almost 51 years. And I don't recall really even getting much of a look at anybody else's penis, let alone their testicles. And when I've been in the women's bathrooms, they don't tend to have urinals. Perhaps they should. But they tend to have stalls. And so at most I see somebody's shoes and maybe their pants pushed down around their ankles, and then you have to deal with, sounds and smells and stuff. But why don't we grow up and just acknowledge that everybody poops? By and large, if my trans friends have an issue with anything that I said in that defense, by all means, send me a correction. I'm not going to claim to be an expert. I was just there trying to be the give the best full-throated support to trans rights that I could, given the absurdity of someone claiming that he could just claim he was a toad. So throughout this discussion of God, Trump, and the future of America, there was very little discussion about God. One of my big disappointments is that we didn't do audience Q&A. Travis came out and actually asked the audience, would they prefer us to keep talking or would they prefer going to Q&A? And while there were a few people who were very vocal and eager to go to Q&A, the majority were like, nope, just keep talking. And so we did. But I don't think we got much further on any of the relevant issues. There was no real discussion about Trump, which doesn't particularly bother me. I wanted to have a discussion with him in particular, and this is to answer a question that has come in frequently, which is, why on earth would you platform that guy? Why on earth would you sit down with that guy? He's terrible. He's terrible on abortion. He's terrible on trans rights. He's terrible on this. Yeah, that's the reason. First of all, I don't know that I'm platforming someone if they have 1 million followers. I think they have a platform, and the purpose was to have access, each of us access each other's audience to get the conversation out there so that I could show the flaws in his thinking. And while we didn't get to cover every flaw in his thinking, when you start the evening by claiming that you can believe something without any evidence and should not be considered to be on weaker footing than someone who does not believe that, I think that's pretty catastrophic to everything else that you're getting ready to say. And in the other cases, when you're talking about how you could pretend to be a toad, or somebody might go into a bathroom and pop their testicles out, or that climate change isn't the issue people are saying it is, and the proof of this is that the Obamas just bought a house on the coast, I think it was worth it to show that at every point in that conversation where there was a moment to present what you thought and why, he had flawed epistemology, bad reasoning, clear bias, and monumental ignorance, and just suspicion. Ooh, we can't make food free because people will just take it all. Well, giving people the right and access to stuff doesn't mean that you don't have regulations on it, that you can't do things to make sure that it's given out equally. I've worked with Atheists Helping the Homeless and Humanists at Work and other locally. They meet on Sundays under I-35, and they give away stuff. I've done live streams of it on my YouTube once or twice. They give away toothpaste and socks and everything else. Free. It's free. And you know how we keep people from not grabbing 20 tubes of toothpaste? We tell them they can just take one. We don't even need a regulation. We were able to sort that out and get as many good products to the people in need as possible for free, without any actual legal authority apart from, hey, this is ours and we get to decide who we're going to give it to. We didn't need to create regulations, but we had guidelines and regulations in place. If you walk into a grocery store right now and they're out of toilet paper and limited on other products, I was in one the other day, and there are signs up that say, hey, in the interest of making sure everybody can get something, we're limiting this to one per customer. We didn't need to pass a law, yet the grocery store somehow manages to make sure that people can't take more than what they need in order to deprive others who are also in need. To pretend as if that these potential solutions are so problematic that people just be running rampant and abusing the system and taking stuff that they don't need is just bizarre. I'm not going to go into my dentist and say, you know what, I'd like these 2 teeth removed and replaced, and then go in the next day and say, oh, I'd like this again. This isn't about elective stuff. This is about keeping people alive. This is about herd immunity. This is about making sure that we have a society that is functional. And still, there's plenty of incentive and motivation to work towards bettering yourself and bettering your lot in life. But we don't need to have a massive income disparity. We don't need to have massive disparity in access to health care. We don't need to and should not be marginalizing people because of their gender identity, their gender expression, their sexuality, anything like that. What's happening here is that he has a collection of bad ideas, which I think we've demonstrated are for bad reasons, and wants to impose them on the rest of us. That's why I thought it was important to at least one time sit down with somebody who has loads of followers, and we can go through the debate. People can go through it forever, and we can dig through stuff. I'm sure that I will find things in there that were mistakes on my part, and more mistakes that he made than I haven't even addressed. But at least there was the opportunity to get 2 competing lines of thought out where, at least in my view, and hopefully in the view of others who watched it, became very clear that there was one individual there that was concerned about human beings and reason, and the other one was concerned about their pocketbook. Even their objections to climate science was about what these other people are trying to force them to do. He said similar things in the past with regard to, paying for education or health care for others. Why should I have to do that? Well, I don't have any kids, so why should any of my tax money go to public schools? Oh, because I benefited from and had access to those public schools, and me paying it back is a way to acknowledge that. Oh, and because I live in a society with those other people who are going to benefit from that. And I'm better off if society as a whole is better educated and better able to function and has more knowledge. I spend less of my time getting into discussions about whether or not we should have health care, or whether food should be free, or whether people should be paid a living wage, if the people that I'm talking to have had access to better education. Because the hope there is that even if we disagree, it's not that Dinesh wants what's in the worst interest of America. He thinks he wants what's best for America. It's just a matter of showing him that what he thinks is best is actually not best. It's entirely possible that someone could genuinely care about the best for the world and be convinced that the best thing they could do is to exterminate 50% of the population, the Thanos conclusion. It's not that Thanos didn't want what was best. He was just wrong about what was actually best. And if you start by saying that I'm going to believe this without evidence and I'm not on weaker footing, exposing that is the first step to getting you to see and acknowledge that maybe your beliefs aren't justified and maybe you're wrong about what is actually in our best interest. Just that little step is a start, but there's a lot more work to be done, and Dinesh is definitely not alone. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.